Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Consumer Behavior and Zero Waste Communities Inform, Enable, Incentivize, and Regulate. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a couple housekeeping items. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, you can call GoToWebinar's customer support line at 877-582-7011. That is 877-582-7011. Because of the size of the audience, we will be keeping the session in listen-only mode. If you have to disconnect from the webinar and want to listen only, you can do this by calling the 914-614-3221. The presentation will be recorded for later viewing. At this point, all lines are muted, but you can, and we do encourage you to participate and submit questions to us at any time during the webinar. The question panel is on the right side of your screen. Simply click the plus sign next to the word question, type your question, and send it. If you don't see the question box on your control panel, try clicking on the tools menu at the top of the panel and then the question selection. We'll be moderating the questions along the way and seeking themes of questions to ask at the end of the webinar. Let me now turn things over to our host, Ann Johnson, the Principal and Vice President of Global Sustainability at Resource Recycling Systems, who will be the host of today's webinar. Ann?
Great, thanks so much. And thank you all for attending. We're really excited to talk about consumer behavior in zero waste communities. We feel like consumer behavior and how we can sort of enable communities to drive solutions through behavior is an undervalued topic, but an exceedingly important one. So today I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Doug McKenzie-Mohr. He's the president of McKenzie-Mohr & Associates. He has a very long and esteemed career in this area. Also, I'd like to introduce Professor Wesley Schultz from the Department of Psychological Science at California State University. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Julie Colehour. She's a partner at C+C. All of them have deep experience in this area, so I'm really excited to have them share their insights with us today. And we got to go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to give a quick overview just to set a little bit of context for this conversation. So we've had a number of webinars around, zero waste communities and what that means and what actions can we take. Often that conversation tends to focus on infrastructure and recycling. And what we want to do today is bring that conversation around what role do we as individuals in our communities have to help make these systems work, and where should we be thinking about taking action, because it's not always end of life. So how we talk about and communicate about zero waste really matters. We see how effective good messaging can be in commerce with really great, marketing departments. And I have this example from iPod, from Apple and iPod, which, their ad campaign had a huge influence on how not just youth, but everybody's, thought and started listening about music. And what I'd like to do is sort of set an aspiration is we can do something similar when we talk about zero waste. So developing language and campaigns around those activities that drive zero waste is really important. And today we're going to hear some case examples, some frameworks of how this can be done. I think one of the things we all agreed on as a group here is that making the benefits clear, personalized, localizing them to your community, and being culturally relevant is really important in terms of overall effectiveness. And so, that helps us have an informed citizenry. We can talk about environmental issues, we can talk about economic issues, and we can talk about opportunities for innovation. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm just going to end with talking about where are behaviors needed to enable zero waste communities and how do we achieve them. And this is where we're really going to ask people to broaden their thinking around this topic. There's a lot of focus on end of use issues around recycling, but really the biggest opportunity for benefit really lies upstream in where we make decisions around purchasing and consumption habits. And there's a lot less focus on that. And albeit there's some tension there, but at the same time, it's an area of great innovation where we're seeing new business models in the shared economy, reuse models. And likewise, we see it around energy efficiency, but we don't often have a lot of focus on use habits, sort of our daily waste minimization habits. So we're going to talk about the opportunities and behaviors we need at all of these points around the life cycle of products. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. And I believe we're starting with Doug.
Starting with Wes.
Sorry, Wes. Sorry, we're starting with you.
All right. Can you hear me? Am I live?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Anne, for the overview and the introduction. And when we talk about zero waste, we're talking about changing behavior. And achieving zero waste will require that people do things differently, from purchasing decisions, disposal choices. We need individuals to change what they do. And while technology and policy can play a role, it ultimately comes down to human behavior. Unfortunately, we know a lot about human behavior. More than 100 years of research has provided some clear insights into why people do what they do and how to motivate change. So in developing zero waste programs and policies, where better to look than the science of human behavior to fields like psychology, economics, and marketing. Now, I have just a few minutes today, and I want to offer two lessons from across these areas of research. For those of you that would like to dig into this in a little more depth, the two papers that are shown here on the slide, especially the one on strategies for behavior change, offer a readable overview. And this paper is available, I think it was distributed when you registered. All right, so now to my two lessons. First, human behavior is driven by motivation and constrained by behavior. And in just a minute, we'll hear Doug McKenzie-Mohr talk about community-based social marketing, which builds on this point. Motivation can be understood as the sum of the benefits that a person associates with a specific behavior. These are all the reasons that they see for taking an action. So things like saving money, protecting the environment, moral obligations, or social responsibility. Then the barriers are all the reasons that prevent them from taking action. Things like difficulty, ambiguity, lack of a supporting community, so on and so forth. Motivation is something that originates within a person, and barriers can be thought of as things that are largely outside of the person, that is, the context. So as a useful metaphor, and this graphic here illustrates this metaphor that I'm going to introduce, think about the role of benefits and barriers as the ocean and a seawall. And the level of motivation reflects the strength of the ocean waves, and the barriers reflect the wall that stop these waves from passing. Now, in the top panel of this slide, the motivation is low and the barriers are high. In this case, the person is unlikely to engage in the desired behavior. But in the second panel, the barriers are low and motivation is high. And this is our goal. And in this case, most people are going to take action. Now, before moving off of this slide, I want to make an important point here. Research suggests that our best chances of success lie in lowering the barriers. And yes, increasing motivation can be helpful, but the largest influence on behaviors are typically found in the context. Things like convenience, availability, cost, social support, or social norms. So as a first step, I recommend starting there. Rather than trying to convince people that they should do a difficult behavior, make it easier to do that thing. And this is a critical point. And if you take just one thing away from my remarks today, make it this one. Pay attention to the context. Okay, so the next slide shows a partial list of tools that have been shown to change behavior. And you'll notice that I've placed these tools in a conceptual grid representing the levels of barriers and benefits. Some of these tools target motivation, like commitments or education, and others target barriers, like financial incentives and convenience. So in this paper, and this is the one that was sent out by email, I summarize each of these tools and then talk about choosing the best tool for the specific behavior that you're trying to change and to target. All right, so with that, my brief opening remarks, I will turn it back over to Ann.
Okay, thanks for that, Wes. And now I will turn it over to Doug.
Right. Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Wes. I want to start off, first of all, by thanking all of you for being on this call today. And I hope for everyone that you're beginning to see some light on the horizon with respect to the pandemic. I want to start off by suggesting that the genesis for community-based social marketing, which is a framework that I began to write about 30 years ago, is the weakness of information-intensive programs in bringing about changes in behavior. A review of the environmental psychology literature done by Andrew Dart in 2008, he summarized that literature by basically saying, about 80% of the factors that lead people to be involved in environmentally beneficial behaviors have nothing to do with knowledge and awareness. Right? They're focused on addressing the barriers, for example, that Wes was just speaking about. But the vast majority of programs that we deliver in our communities focus usually on just trying to get people to know more and care more, right? To see the benefits of the behaviors we wish to engage in. And that's rarely sufficient to get the behavioral changes that we need to move us towards zero waste. So I want to introduce you just briefly to this process of community-based social marketing. As you can see on your screen, it's based around 5 steps. The first step is to carefully select which behaviors are most worthwhile for us to pursue. There's a plethora of different actions that we can encourage people to be involved in related to waste reduction. And we're really asking the question that Ann was asking earlier, which is which of these actions are most important for us to focus on first. So the first step of CBSM provides us with an opportunity to take a long list of waste reduction behaviors and cull it down to what I call tier 1 behaviors, the behaviors that are most worthwhile for us to go after. In the second step, we're trying to identify what do people perceive, what are the barriers to the behaviors that we select in the first step. And one of the things I want to mention, which sort of builds upon what Wes was just saying, is these barriers are often remarkably specific. So the barriers to a food waste reduction initiative are going to be different from the barriers of someone being involved in backyard composting or someone being involved in curbside organic collection. They're all behaviors related to organic reductions, but each of those behaviors have different barriers. And if we don't understand intimately what the barriers are to that particular action, we're unlikely to get people to be involved in behavior. So we need to understand what are the barriers and what would motivate people. What do they see as being beneficial? In the third step of CBSM, we're trying to develop strategies strategically to reduce the barriers, as Wes was mentioning, and amplify people's motivation. But you'll notice here it says develop strategies. It does not say develop strategy. So it's plural rather than singular. And one of the reasons why that's important is we're obviously interested at the local level of developing programs that are as cost effective as possible. And if we only develop and pilot test one program, we'll know the level of behavioral change for that initiative. We'll know whether or not it was cost effective, but what we can't know is that it's as cost effective as possible. So one of the recommendations out of CBSM is on a very small scale, pilot test several strategies, for example, to deal with cigarette litter against one another and find out both what's the level of behavioral change, but what's the cost to deliver the program. Because you might have 2 different programs, program A and B, and program B might bring about a 40% reduction in cigarette butt litter. Program A brings about a 50% reduction, but if program B costs half as much to deliver than program A does, we can deliver it to far more people. So we want to develop several strategies in the third step, making good use of knowledge and social sciences, pilot test several strategies against each other, and then move on to broad scale implementation. So very, very quickly, that's an overview of CBSM. Can I have the next slide, please? There is far more information on my website. You can see a link there to go onto the site and learn more. We have articles, cases, reports, You can connect with colleagues from around the globe who are working on different waste reduction initiatives. We also have a Fostering Behavior Change Minute, which is a weekly newsletter that has nearly 20,000 people subscribe to it, provides information from the behavioral sciences and how you can utilize that information. And Laura, I don't have the ability to be able to post items to the question and answer, but if you could post the link that I sent you to email up there, you can just simply click on that link if any of you are interested in signing up for that minute, and you'll get this weekly email from me giving you information about how to use social science knowledge in the programs you learn. And that's it for me, Anne. Very quick overview.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Okay, and now we're going to turn it over to Julie, and she's going to dig into some further details and examples.
Thanks. So just to layer on what we heard from Wes and Doug so far, I wanted to give a sense of, what happens once you've gotten your framework really figured out and you're ready to start thinking about how you need to communicate with the audiences you need to communicate with. So this first slide just outlines the 10 steps that you should go to if you're planning a social marketing campaign. And Doug and Wes really covered the first parts or the first steps allocated here in terms of, what are your goals and objectives? Who are your audiences? What is that behavior change? Key decision to think about when you're planning a program. What research do you need to do? And then the identifications of your barriers, your benefits, and your motivators that are related, specific to your audience and specific to the behavior change you're going after. Once you have that upfront sort of 5 steps completed, then you can dig into figuring out how you want to communicate. So what are your messages? What channels should you use to communicate? What do you want to pilot based on what Doug said? And how are you going to evaluate that and look for success? So my main point here is to say most people actually jump in and start on step 9. They go right in. We just need a communications plan. We need to get out there. We need to start talking to people. But if you don't do steps 1 through 8, you are not going to be as successful as you could be on step 9. So make sure you do the upfront framework first. You can go to the next slide. This is really a visual that we like to use when we're thinking about how are we going to break through and get audiences to change their behavior. And as Doug said, awareness alone has no correlation to actual behavior change. You do obviously need someone to know about an issue before they can change their behavior, but there's no causality in them changing their behavior. So the red part of this cycle starts with people being aware of the issue. Then they get into a little deeper level of understanding about an issue. Maybe they know a little bit about it. But really where this wheel starts to work is when you get in social marketing is when you get to relevance. So the purple part of the wheel. Relevance is when you are able to deliver to the audience, as Wes had mentioned, the motivations that overcome the barriers and convince that person to try the behavior change for the first time, which is the differentiation part of the wheel. Now I'll say once you have someone try a behavior, you want to be really sure they're successful in that experience because, research shows that, think about it. If you try a behavior and it doesn't work out for some reason, you're very unlikely to try it a second time. It's going to take more effort to overcome the barriers to get them to try it a second time. So once they do the behavior, ensure a successful experience. And if you can do that, hopefully you can turn that person into a loyal advocate of your behavior who can influence other people. And then this wheel feeds itself. So whenever you're thinking about developing a campaign, you kind of want to map people and move them through this continuum. Go to the next slide. And then I just also wanted to mention a few things about message development, because this is an area where I think I see social marketing fall down many, many times. And it's because we all want to try to tell our audiences too much, because there's a lot they need to know and there's a lot they need to do. And this really happens a lot in recycling programs where, we try to tell people to do 20 things, 10 things, even 5 things is too much. How do you focus on a singular behavior so you can map those singular barriers and motivators to overcome that behavior? So in message development, you really want to know your audience and you need to keep your messages really, really simple. So I say beware of message clutter. Like everybody on this call is exposed to something like 2,000 to 3,000 messages every single day. So you need to think about that's your competitive landscape that your message has to cut through. And you only have about 3 to 5 seconds to catch someone's attention. So what that means is your messages need to be simple. If they're emotional, you're more likely to maybe grab the person, and they need to be relevant and timely to the behavior you're trying to change. And then the other thing I'll note, because I think this is very relevant to zero waste, is that we want to sell the benefits to the audience, not the features of what you're asking them to do. So in order to get them to change their behavior, again, you've got to motivate them. You have to focus on your benefits and your motivators that overcome the barriers, not on the features, because features alone are not going to change behavior. So it's really important when you're doing your message strategy on how you're going to communicate to be simple and to focus on motivators that overcome barriers. All right, back over to Anne.
Julie, just a quick follow-up. Could you just explain what a feature is versus a benefit?
Yeah, so it's like how something works, right? So if you're explaining how something works or what you want somebody to do, rather than explaining the benefit or the motivator to do it, if that makes sense. So, we all love how things work, especially like, in recycling where it's, it's very technical, et cetera. But you know what? Your audience doesn't care and it's not going to motivate them. So instead, focus on what is the benefit to them, of doing that behavior, whatever it is. And if you've done your social marketing planning process, you know that. You know what benefits they're looking for, and you know what you can do to motivate them to overcome their barriers. So you want to focus on those things in your message strategy.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's get into a panel discussion. So I have a few questions for the panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline Grace to ask questions from the audience. So let's get started. So this is a question for all of you. How do you begin creating a strategy that influences consumer behavior? And specifically, maybe you could give us an example of what tactics have been successful and what generates the fastest results? So for any of you?
So
Wes or Julie?
Sure,
Yeah,
I'll jump in on this one. I know we all have points that we want to make here. And to start us off, I would say that you need to focus on a specific behavior as your target. And I think we heard that, across all of the opening remarks. I mean, consider a campaign that promotes zero waste. Like, we want to encourage our residents and businesses to engage in zero waste. Who's in favor? And I suspect almost everybody's going to be in favor of zero waste. Waste sounds like a bad thing, and so I don't want waste. But that broad topic is not going to be sufficient to drive behavior change. And so as a first consideration, I would say we need to be clear about the specific behavior that we want to occur. Who, where, when, and we need to target that behavior rather than these broader types of statements. So I'll start with that as my first response.
Yeah, and I can layer on that a little bit. I mean, I think often people start with the question of what tactics should I use? And that's the wrong question to start with, right? You want to start with the question of what behavior am I trying to change? And again, we're going to sound like a broken record by the end of this, but what are the barriers and what are the motivators and what are the benefits? And once you figure that out, you map your tactics that are as close as you can get them to the place that the behavior occurs or where you can have influence over that behavior. So, if you think about, recycling behaviors in a home, you want to figure out how to get your messaging into the home as close to the time that people are doing the recycling behavior as possible, right? If it's a consumption reduction behavior, then you want to get that towards the point of time when the person is making that consumption choice, right? So your tactics should map as closely as you can to the behavior that you're trying to encourage.
I would just add to that, Anne, that I think it's really helpful, first of all, to be asking ourselves which behaviors are most worthwhile for us to pursue. Mm-hmm. And in my book, Fostering Sustainable Behavior, I recommend or suggest that when we're talking about any domain related to sustainability, obviously today we're talking about zero waste, that we're asking essentially how impactful is each behavior that we could go after. And unfortunately, Anne, that's where people often stop, is they just look at the impact that a behavior might have. We want to have information both about the impact that a behavior might have in reducing waste, but we also want to try to ascertain what's the probability of people engaging in different waste reduction behaviors. because highly impactful behaviors that no one wants to do are not very helpful to us. So we're looking for this intersection between impact and probability, but then we're also asking at the same time, what are people currently doing? What behaviors have they already adopted? So if you think about the answer to those three characteristics, we want high impact, high probability, and presently low adoption rates. Those are the behaviors that can be most meaningful for us in terms of thinking about trying to reduce the impact that people's different choices are having. And so for me, that's a starting point. You take a long list of behaviors and cull them down to the most important waste reduction activities. Then, and only then, as Julie and Wes was suggesting, you do barrier and benefit research to find out what is impeding people from engaging in this action, what would they see as being beneficial. And then the interesting part of that, Anne, is that once we've done the barrier and benefit research, our strategies almost always become self-evident. We know what to do given the barrier and benefit research that's been done. And we do that work with our target audiences. What often happens, as Julie was suggesting, is that people start with strategies. You know, they jump straight into what the strategy should look like. And the CBSM approach is really suggesting, no, let's start first of all with understanding which behaviors are most important. What is it that precludes people? What would motivate them? And then the strategies leap out of having done that foundational research. So, you know, to respond to your question, I think it's process leads to good design of trying to understand the barriers to specific actions, what would motivate people, and then we're thinking about strategies.
Could I just ask you all to maybe just very quickly share one anecdote of a case example that you think has been really successful that people might look to?
So one of the interesting things, and I'll go back to sort of recycling, composting as an example, but I think there has been a lot of effort towards trying to convince people to put recycling in the recycling bin, right? You know, we all know this, many people have worked on these programs. Some research that I was involved with recently sort of framed that was actually not the right question or not the right behavior to be encouraging, because that's not what people were thinking about in their home as they were doing the behavior. What they were thinking about is which bin does it go in? Garbage, compost, or recycling, not should I put this in the recycling bin? And so with that insight in mind, it was a complete reframing of the way the behaviors were being promoted and what the barriers were and how people were making that decision. So that's an example of, you know, don't make assumptions about what your behavior is. Go look at what your audience is doing and how they're thinking about it, and make sure you're framing things in how they're making decisions related to those behaviors.
Oh, fascinating. Doug, do you have an example?
Yeah, I do. This is a very recent example that was unfortunately cut short by the pandemic. But this is a project that I worked on with the Houston Zoo, and specifically we were targeting the recycling of fishing line. And the reason why we're focusing on this particular behavior is there's very good work that's been done by both the EPA and by NOAA in the United States demonstrating that when we look at nesting shoreline birds and when we look at sea turtles, it's people fishing off of piers and jetties that seems to dramatically lead to their entanglement, right? It tends not to be commercial fishing, it tends not to be offshore recreational fishing, it tends to be onshore fishing is the major threat to them. And what we did in this particular case is we arranged to have a kiosk display. So as people were walking out to this pier to fish, on the kiosk display, we said, you know, here's why it's important to recycle your fishing line in order to protect nesting shoreline birds and sea turtles. And then on the right-hand side, we actually had photographs. These are public, what I call public and durable commitments that people who are fishing on those piers to actually engage in that behavior. And what we're doing there is we're grouping together these commitments close in space and time to the behavior that we want to encourage in. You literally can't walk out to the pier unless you walk by this display. When we first pilot tested this, we weren't sure whether anyone would allow us to actually have their photographs taken. Of the 21 different men that we approached, and they were all men, 18 of the 21 said yes, and the 3 that said no wanted us to wait until they'd caught a fish before we took a photograph of them. We nearly tripled the amount of fishing line that was actually being recycled because, again, we're providing this social norm that's serving as a prompt that this is expected behavior in this circumstance, and then picking up on something Wes said earlier about convenience, where we're providing actual recycling fishing line containers along the pier. But it's this combination of encouraging the behavior, close in space and time to when the behavior is actually going to occur.
Oh, what a terrific program. That's really interesting. All right, so I'm going to move to my next question. So as we all know, waste happens for all sorts of reasons. If we want to influence and raise awareness and influence behavior around waste, how do we go about doing that? And Wes, let's start with you.
Thanks. I had a great response for your last question. So
Oh,
now
go
I'm
ahead.
gonna I'm gonna move to the new one. But you know, I think what comes up here, right? Because we're presuming in the question that raising awareness will influence consumer behaviors around waste. And while I think there's a role for awareness, I think that if we isolate that as our primary target, we're generally going to miss in terms of behavior change. For most behaviors in this domain, there's a lot of awareness that exists already. And so I think we need to check the level of awareness around these particular behaviors, because most of them, we're talking about recycling, we're talking about organics in the waste stream, we're talking about litter prevention, we're talking about waste. People don't like waste, it's a negative term. So there's already quite a bit of awareness. I don't think we need to convince them that this is an important issue. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe in a particular community, it is low and would warrant raising awareness. But for the most part, I think that awareness is not our primary target, and we need to look elsewhere. And I also want to just take a moment to build on some of the previous comments about targeting behaviors, and that is to target a behavior and not to target a totality of behaviors, because each of those behaviors is going to occur in different people in a different context. There's different motivators, there's different barriers for it. And so being specific in what we do. And when I recommend this to organizations, they often get very frustrated and they say, well, I don't want to take a piecemeal approach, right? I don't want to change just one thing. I want to change all of these waste behaviors. But in doing that, you're likely going to fail. And so if you focus on one and rotate, right? So that now we're focusing on this one, but 6 months from now, or some, as the campaign matures, we're going to rotate to different behaviors within this constellation in order to move change overall. So I wanted to make that point, that we need to target specific actions, but that doesn't mean that we can't put it into a broader umbrella of campaigns that move us toward this zero waste goal.
And just since I didn't let you answer the case example above, do you have a case example of a campaign that did this, that kind of just rotated through different things?
So the one that I was going to describe was a campaign through the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Program in San Diego called Think Blue. And the Think Blue provided an umbrella, right? So you're talking about raising awareness, but within that umbrella were specific campaigns. So each year, the Think Blue campaign would select a behavior to target that was connected with a particular pollutant that was observed in the stormwater runoff. So there might, for example, be a campaign that focused on home-based pesticides, or one that was based on litter prevention or pet waste, or, right? So there was this collection of behaviors, but over time, the campaign focused on different ones in particular.
Great, thanks. Julie or Doug, how about, this sort of broad question that went sort of against all the rules you laid out, that, this sort of generic view on raising awareness? What is your response on any approach to this that for our listeners?
Well, I'll just put a quick point on something Wes said that I think is really important that we haven't focused on yet. Often we'll see, I have these 10 pitfalls of social marketing, and one of them is assuming your audience is everyone. And I think especially for public sector programs, there's a need to want to say that we're communicating with all of our constituents. But that doesn't work. You have to pick who are your priority audiences for each behavior and then do your barriers, motivators, and benefits. So the other layer here is realizing you want to be successful, you need to, focus on priority audience groups sort of one at a time, because they're going to have unique barriers, benefits, and motivators as you move it through. So that's a really important step in the process to pay attention to.
That's
And
really
can I just
fascinating.
build on that, Julie, if you're done? I think one of the ways that I find really helpful, and to be thinking about individual behavioral change programs that we wish to deliver, is to ask ourselves, which is almost always the case with expected waste reduction, do we have a behavioral chain? Behavioral chain is an idea that I started talking about 10 years ago. So here's a very clear example of it. Think about what's involved in getting people to be involved in backyard composting. We talk about composting as if it's one unitary action, but the reality is what we're really asking is that someone find their way to a nursery or to a hardware store to purchase a composter. So the first behavior is they have to travel there. The second behavior is they have to pick out the composter. The third is they have to pay for it. The fourth is they have to transport it back home. The fifth is they have to put it together. The sixth is that they have to site it someplace in the yard. The seventh is they have to find a pail or container that they're going to collect their kitchen scraps in. The eighth is that they have to convince their family members to participate in diversion. Then the ninth is that they have to start taking it to the composter. The 10th is that they have to start mixing with yard waste. And then they have to be stirring it on a frequent basis, and they have to harvest the compost, and they have to spread it on lawns or gardens and repeat that whole process. Right? The reason why that's really helpful in thinking about program design is the barriers reside at the level of each of those individual actions that make up this thing that we call composting. And as Julie was pointing out, we have different segmented audiences. So if we think about the very first step of going to get a composter, well, for people who do not have a vehicle, all right, or easy mass transit options, I mean, imagine someone getting on a bus with a composter. We're taking out a huge segment of our audiences by not thinking about what the barriers are for a particular part of this idea that we call composting and how they might differ for different targeted audiences. So it's really, really helpful to take a waste reduction action and ask yourself, do we have a chain of actions that sit underneath that? What are the barriers to each of those? And then finally, do they differ for different segmented audiences? And how do we go about addressing those? That gets us a lot farther of where we want to be going, right? And you can imagine that awareness is just a really small part of that.
Yeah. That's really an interesting way to think about it. I'll just share this with you, Doug, that I have the benefit of living in a rural area. My home compost pile is the distance I can throw from my front step. But I do all those other actions. All right, so let's pivot a little bit, but I think this is really interesting because when you were talking about how each step in the chain has a different set of barriers, and actually as you presented that, it made me think a little bit about some of the barriers to vaccination. And so the other question we have is how do we take the idea of community-based social marketing and make it more inclusive of diverse communities? So who would like to that one?
Is that probably directed to me first?
Sure.
Okay. I think it's really important to be thinking about diversity, to be thinking about ethnicity, et cetera. But I think in some ways that maybe that's the wrong question to be asking. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if you take the approach of thinking about, well, what are the barriers to each of the items that I just mentioned in terms of composting? Well, you could imagine that ethnicity, diversity is an important issue, but it may be in fact that what's shared by a number of low-income newcomers in the United States is lack of access to a vehicle. And that's the common thread that's running across them. And that's why I really like what Wes was saying earlier, is this idea that the barriers are remarkably specific. And if we understand what the barriers are, then we're asking a more subtle question than asking, well, how do we deal with diversity? And it's not that diversity isn't important, but I think sometimes what we do is we jump to that and think, well, diversity is the issue, and it could be, but we need to be thinking in addition to that, are there specific traits or characteristics that go along with different potential targeted audiences that maybe really are not ethnicity? It might be instead that there's barriers in terms of disposable income that makes the idea of getting a composter just a non-starter for them, or they don't have transportation options that makes it convenient to get home. And so I find it really helpful to be asking that question first. So for example, if we look at biking and asking people to commute, which is, you know, outside of this domain of waste reduction, number one barrier is not having a bike, right? It's not an ethnicity issue. It's actually having a bike or not having a bike that then raises the question, well, what are the barriers to people having a bike? To which, of course, disposable income is going to be a large issue. So yes, we want to be thinking about diversity issues, but I don't think we want to be putting ourselves in a position in which we are imagining that that may be, it's not that it's unimportant, and we don't want to be putting ourselves in a position in which we're allowing that to cloud what might be more subtle barriers that are associated with different diverse audiences.
Yeah, I have a.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to chime in with sort of two thoughts on this. And since you mentioned vaccine, I'll use the COVID vaccine as an example where many people that were working on this were assuming that the uptake among diverse communities was due to vaccine hesitancy and a reluctance to get the vaccine based on a number of different factors. And that's clearly part of the puzzle. But recent CDC research just came out and said actually access is driving those numbers just as much as hesitancy is. So looking at overcoming those access barriers to getting vaccine available to those communities is going to be a large piece of solving the puzzle. And so you have to make sure you do the research and you don't jump to assumptions, that you know what's impacting those communities. The other thing I'll say is that if you know, certain communities are part of your priority audience that makes sense for the behavior change that you're trying to target, it's really important that you create a campaign for them, especially if it's in language audiences, independently, and that you don't create English materials and then try to turn them into materials that are going to work for that culture or work in that language. And so this is the idea of transcreation, which is if you do have a number of audiences and some of them speak another language or are diverse culturally, that you want to upfront create things specifically for them. Because if you do something in English first and then try to switch it over, it's not going to resonate and it's not going to be authentic. And that's the traditional way it has been done in the past. And where things are really moving now is that approach of independently looking at those and creating sort of parallel messaging and campaigns for diverse audiences and cultures.
Oh, that's great guidance. Wes?
Yeah, so another consideration in thinking about reaching and working with diverse communities is who's the communicator? And, you know, one of the research findings is a consistent demonstration that personal communication has a big impact on behavior. Hearing a message or a recommendation from somebody that you know or somebody that you trust can dramatically change your behavior. And so this is just a principle in general, is not specific to diverse communities, but we need to be cognizant of the fact that when we are rolling out a campaign, that the person who hears the message or receives the campaign materials is going to evaluate it based on the source that it came from. And so having somebody communicate it who's part of their group, their social identity, will go a long way towards their receptivity to it and to ultimately adopting the recommended behaviors, as opposed to having somebody come from an outside group, a distant group, maybe a non-trusted group. Even if they agree with the behavior, they're saying, well, I don't know if I should do this. But if somebody they know or trust directly communicates with them, I think we can have much more success.
Oh, that's great. Well, one of my takeaways from this discussion that I really like is that idea of using the lens of barriers to evaluate behavior and things is a very objective way of looking at things, not presupposing or bringing in any bias or anything into your conversation. I really like that. I think that's a really important takeaway from the conversation. So we had talked about incentives and what role incentives play. So my last question for you all before we open up the questioning is, you know, what role does policy and incentives have in helping or hindering behavior change? Who would like to start?
I'm going to punt this to Wes because he and I co-wrote an article together and he wrote the section on incentives. So Wes.
Yes, I have very strong opinions about incentives. So,
Which I
I
agree
mean,
with.
the research is clear that incentives can change behavior, and I don't want to take issue with that. The problem is it doesn't change behavior in a sustainable or durable way. That is, the behavior change becomes tied to the incentive. And so if that incentive is short-lived, which it typically is because organizations can't continue to fund these things indefinitely, then as soon as that incentive is withdrawn, we see a precipitous drop in behavior, often even in recurring behaviors to levels that were lower than it was before the incentive. So I think incentives can be used, there's a place for them, but we need to be very careful. And I would view an incentive as a last resort. So if you look in my grid that I presented, right, I do have incentives in there as a behavior change tool because they've been widely studied, but their best time to use them is in instances where the barriers are very high and the benefits are very low. It's like you don't have any other resort. It's the last resort that we have, and I can't come up with a better approach. So my view is we should avoid them when at all possible.
Interesting. Julie?
And I'll jump in and sort of talk about the policy side of the question. So I think there are definitely times when policy tools can be a great way to change behavior. There are certain members of the public that if the policy changes or there's a law, they are going to follow it and change their behavior. So you can have some very fast behavior adoption using policy levers, and I think that can be part of any social marketing program and makes sense. Distracted driving is a great example. When distracted, cell phone use in-car laws have gone into effect across the country, you'll see a real spike in behavior change that does sustain too. So, after the law it might dip a little, but overall you get an upward level of people practicing the behavior. Not everyone will do it, and you're probably still going to have to do behavior change campaigns and get in there and encourage the behavior, but it is a great way in many cases to get some momentum around your behavior change programs on the beginning of the curve. The other place it can work is on the back end of the curve. So once you've got a lot of people and there's just a small percentage who just aren't doing the behavior for whatever reason, having a policy that requires it can get to some of those last people that aren't willing to adopt it on a voluntary basis. So it does make sense in the mix.
And can I chime in?
Sure.
I find it really helpful, Anne, to think of there being sort of three broad boxes or categories of behavioral change. And the first is policy. The second is voluntary behavioral change programs. And the third is regulatory behavioral change initiatives. And when I'm using the word policy, I'm talking very specifically about programs in which we pass a policy that circumscribes choice. You can buy whatever type of vehicle you want in the United States, but it's going to have a high CAFE standard, for example. That's a policy that's circumscribing choice. You can buy whatever type of shower head you want, but it's going to be of a high level of efficiency. The problem with policies is we rarely have, initially, the public and political support to pass them, which moves us into the sort of second category of behavioral change initiatives, where we're delivering programs to encourage people to voluntarily purchase a fuel-efficient vehicle, to voluntarily use reusable shopping bags, to do food waste reductions, etc. And the idea is that we don't want to be stuck there. But what we're trying to do is build up the public and political support for a policy change. We're banning plastic bags, for example, and we're not going to get to the policy change initially right away because we don't have the public and political support. So most of us are often playing in this sort of second box of behavioral change, where what we really want is a policy change that circumscribes people's choice. And then the third category is regulatory behavioral changes. And the challenge with regulatory behavioral changes is we need people to go along with whatever those regulations are, and we need enforcement that goes along with them. And we can use CBSM to try to drive up voluntary participation in regulation approaches, which then tries to address some of the concerns that Wes just mentioned around incentives, and that reduces our enforcement costs. But I think it's really helpful for people to have this sort of 30,000-foot view. Am I talking about a policy change that circumscribes choice? Am I talking about voluntary behavioral change programs, or am I talking about regulation-based programs? And those are all really quite different approaches to thinking about behaviors. But the first two are intimately linked to one another, and the second, third, in my mind, are intimately linked as well.
Great, thank you. So I think that we're ready to move on to the open questions. But I think that one of the things I've been, I want to sort of remind us all when we're talking about zero waste is that, we do live in a world of finite resources, and this idea of really understanding what the barriers are to driving the behaviors that leads to the change we're looking for is really important. And so I think that as we saw some of these things, how we lower those barriers, convenience and access, I hope that everybody sort of takes away, I think, a bit of that matrix that that Wes shared for us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline, and I will zip.
Thank you, Anne. Well, first, we've received quite a few questions from the audience. And while we have time, only enough time to address a couple of them, we'll do our best to answer more questions offline. So the first question I think I'll select here is, here's one. How might even a small city like ours, Warrenville, with a population of 15,000 people, promote consumer behaviors and zero waste communities and engage the community? How might they do that, and how might they navigate the barriers? Why don't we start with you, Julie?
Oh, great. It's a good question. I mean, this model works regardless of the size. It works regardless of the size of your budget, regardless of the size of your community, etc. If you have to be very focused, but you can do it, you still go through the same process of figuring out what are you trying to achieve, what are your priority behaviors for impact, barriers, motor barriers, all the way down through those steps and do the planning. And it's very scalable. It can be done for small things and it can be done for large things. So I would say for a small community, pick somewhere to start. Figure out for your community, what are your zero waste goals? What is your purpose? And then where can you start and try a few things out, pilot them as Doug mentioned at the beginning, see how they go, and then expand to other behaviors over time. So there is no size constraint here in doing CBSM programs.
Thank you, Julie. Wes, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think what Julie said was great, right? Pick somewhere to start. And in thinking about zero waste for a big metropolitan area is probably going to be very different than zero waste for a smaller city. And so setting some metrics, right? So what are you trying to change? Is it the amount of trash that's being sent to the landfill? Is it the cleanliness of the recycling stream that's being collected? Is it organics that you're trying to divert? Is it litter on the ground? I mean, is it packaging? What is it, right? So you identify for your community, where are our goals and our metrics? And then these principles that we've been talking about become directly relevant. But I think the first piece is figuring out, what does zero waste mean for your community? And it can be different.
Thank you. Doug?
I'm just picking up on what Wes said. I think one of the things that we want to do, and I think there's a real particular role at the national level for CAB around this, is to ask, do we have homogeneity? Do we have, with respect to the barriers to particular behaviors related to waste reduction, or do we have, as Wes was suggesting, a lot of diversity? One of the organizations that's done this really well in the United States is the Urban Sustainability Directors Networks, where they've gotten together as a group and said, well, what are some of the behaviors we'd like to target? Let's try to identify, are the barriers pretty common across the behaviors we're interested in, or do we see a lot of diversity? Where we see, homogeneity, well, that suggests, Jacqueline, we can create strategies and pilot test them in different communities, potentially different sizes, and have those be effective. When we see, in contrast, diversity, as Wes was suggesting, that's not going to work. And so I think it's really helpful to see national agencies like Keep America Beautiful begin to take on that task of working along with affiliates and saying, well, all of you are working on issues related to dog waste. You're working on issues related to contamination of recycling containers, etc. Let's see if we can identify what the barriers are to those behaviors that we want people to be involved in, and whether or not there's some commonality or there's a lot of diversity. And where there is commonality, then it makes a lot of sense to think about developing strategies as USDN has done, testing them in several different jurisdictions. And if they work well, let's roll that up into essentially a toolkit that people can utilize when we know that we've got a lot of similarity around the barriers. But as Wes is suggesting, when you've got diversity, that approach isn't going to work. But I would suggest that as a framework that allows us to make sure that we're spending our money wisely in terms of thinking about program delivery.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And did you want to add anything to that before I go to the next question?
Well, I just want, one of the things that seems clear, I think that Wes kind of said this, zero waste is this huge umbrella term. And you have to be specific underneath it, what behavior you want to address, what do you want to target, because it could be at consumption, it could be at use, it could be, you know, an end of use. So I really, as you were talking, Wes, that analogy just came to my mind that zero waste is this very large umbrella topic.
Thank you. Another question, how might we include the mom and pop small businesses that have limited time and resources to devote to changing consumer behavior? And with that, what can these individual businesses do to drive action among their employees? Maybe we'll go backwards this time. Do you want to jump in there, Doug?
You know, I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is to look at sort of the work that's been done in New South Wales and Australia around food waste reduction, because a lot of that's being done with small restaurants, you know, which might be, you know, emblematic of what you were just suggesting, Jacqueline. And what they've done is they've done very simple approaches where they've said, okay, well, we want to make sure that the people preparing meals are diverting food waste into the right containers. And so they literally will have the people who are doing the food preparation sign a bulletin board that's in close proximity to where the food preparation is being done and where the containers are stored, showcasing that they're going to do the diversion. And what's helpful about that is when you have small numbers of individuals, well, they feel beholden to one another to engage in those behaviors. They all know each other, right? So, you know, there's lots of occasions in which for small organizations, CAP could be developing strategies that work well in those kinds of circumstances because people tend to know each other. So it might be the case in which it's all that we need to be doing is just simple initiatives in which we're educating people, we're providing them with containers, for example, and then we're getting commitments from them in close proximity to behaviors. Right? And so there's, I think, a variety of things coming with behavioral sciences that we could be testing and utilizing with those organizations and then providing those to them as solutions, right? But around that, I really want to encourage coaching. I've worked on a lot of different programs where we've provided toolkits, and if we don't coach people about how to utilize them most effectively, that often doesn't happen, or they're rolled out as well as they should be.
Thank you, Doug. Wes?
So my thought here is that, you know, you present the question like a mom and pop business who maybe sees zero waste as a distraction from what it is that they're doing, their primary type of business, and that if they divert resources or energy towards zero waste goals, then somehow their business and their revenues and their profits are going to go down. And I would really want to challenge that and to say I think that adopting zero waste can be good for business. And you can think about it in a lot of different ways, right? So maybe you're getting some changes in efficiencies with your staffing within your business. Maybe there are shifts in different types of products and the sales of certain types of a product that attract customers, or even the branding of the business as part of this zero waste initiative can serve to attract and broaden a customer base. So I think for a mom and pop business, right, to think creatively about this, and that it's not just something that they have to do, but that it can be supportive of growth in their business context. So I think it's often the case that we think of, you know, conservation or zero waste as contradictory to business practices, and I don't think that needs to be the case at all.
Thank you, Wes. Julie?
Yeah, nothing too much more to add, but I would say, you know, small businesses can be great partners for programs, but the key is to figure out, you know, what is the benefit to them and what's going to motivate them to participate. And it's, you know, just like you would do for any other audience. If you're thinking of them as an audience or a potential channel, you map out those things for the business so that when you go to them, there's something in it for them with what you were asking them to do. It's just not, asking them to do something without a return.
Thank you. Great point. And anything else before I close this out? We're right at the hour.
I don't think so. I just really would like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their experience and expertise. I think it was really, really educational for all of us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care and stay safe, everyone.
As we close the conversation today, I too would like to thank everyone on the call for joining this portion of the Keep America Beautiful Zero Waste webinar. I would also like to extend a very special thanks to you, Anne, and all of the panelists for really taking time out of your busy schedules to lead this vital conversation. Achieving zero waste and creating a circular economy and a more sustainable future can be advanced really when all people take action in their various roles as individuals and to join their neighbors to deliver change. Keep America Beautiful at our core is about helping people find common purpose and inspiring them to take action to clean, green, and beautify their communities. As part of our work, the 23rd Keep America Beautiful Great American Cleanup has begun and extends throughout June. In addition, other Keep America Beautiful programs and educational initiatives will take place throughout the year. You can find these and many other opportunities to take action in your community by visiting us at kab.org. There you will also see that our volunteer portal can help you connect with your local Keep America Beautiful affiliate. Please take a moment now to explore the Keep America Beautiful website and discover how simple and fun it is to be part of creating change. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.